Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this discussion on workplace mental health. And I have to say, I am still thinking about Vic's inspiring talk this morning, and so much to think through there. And really, as I think about when we're talking about mental health in the workplace, we think about it in terms of companies and businesses, larger organizations. And while he was talking, I was thinking about the fact that as clinicians, we are focused on how do we provide care. It's also important to think about how are we supporting clinicians? How are we creating workplaces that support clinicians, that support teachers? So really remembering that the workforce is very broad. And in our work, we sometimes get focused on others, and important to think about how as professionals and whatever we do, we're part of that workforce, and how we need to think about ourselves that way. So thank you for joining us. I'm Lisa Desai. I am a psychologist and Chief Behavioral Health Officer at Mindwise Innovations. Nick Hansel-Snyder is our tech guru today. Nick is our marketing manager, but that does not capture all that he does at Mindwise. So, and Nick is going to monitor the chat and maybe jump in certain parts of the conversation to share his thoughts. So Nick.
Hello, everyone. Just a few quick housekeeping items. So everyone knows we are recording today's presentation and we'll post it to the conference landing page after the events. We want the conversation today to be as interactive as possible. So please feel free to comment in the chat as we discuss things. And you can put specific questions in the Q&A as well. I'll be keeping an eye on both. So whatever's more comfortable for you, just if anything occurs to you, you want to ask, you want to say, just jump in.
Fantastic. Thanks, Nick. So to start off, as we're thinking about behavioral health, which encompasses mental health and substance misuse and our physical well-being, as we talk about behavioral health and mental health in the workplace, we're not only thinking about the current workplace, or the current workforce, but also the future workforce, the young professionals that are entering now or that will be entering in the next generation. And the reason I say that is we know that during the pandemic, we've heard a lot about the Great Resignation, folks leaving their jobs, changing jobs, really questioning what they want to be doing from a professional standpoint, but also that in certain sectors, there are labor shortages. So this idea of really thinking about how do we bring in folks into our work environment that want to stay, that want to commit, that is directly part of supporting folks' behavioral health. And as Nick said, at any point, if you have comments, questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. Happy to address those as we go along. So literally going to go through what are the top 10 reasons, what are the 10 really main reasons that we're addressing behavioral health in the workforce, and that this is a trend that will continue. The first would be that we know the pandemic has surfaced an increase in mental health struggles. So we know that nearly a half of Americans since the pandemic have reported increased depression and anxiety, that substance misuse has increased at significant rates, that during the pandemic, half of adults in the United States have said that they are struggling with a mental health or behavioral health condition, and that we think about, many folks are talking about the pandemic as an event that has brought trauma to folks' lives for a lot of reasons, because of loss of lives, loss of family members, friends, coworkers, also ambiguous grief that's come from perhaps not loss of lives, but loss of tradition, loss of connection, loss of going into the workplace. And so again, this has highlighted the need to address mental health in the workplace because of the pandemic. So that may feel new to a lot of folks. What we know as clinicians and what we know as folks working in organizations, either from HR, either from leadership, or from workplace mental health perspective, is that mental health issues in the workplace are not new. So when Vic was talking about what happens in the family stays in the family, it's very much related to what we thought about in the workplace for decades and decades, which is check your baggage at the door. If you've got something going on in your personal life, don't talk about it at work. Just keep it there. and draw that hard and fast line. We know now it's not possible because of blended work, working from the home, literally, when kids are around, when spouses are around, and so forth. But we've also known that in the past, for decades, it's showed up at work through absenteeism, through disability, through other kinds of ways. So let's not pretend that this is a new phenomenon. Just to share a couple more stats, prior to the pandemic, we know that 1 in 5 American adults were experiencing a mental health challenge. And this is a diagnosed mental health challenge. And that depression has always been one of the top mental health issues that adults have struggled with. Again, this is pre-COVID. So what's the organizational response to this? While it is not new, COVID has really forced us to look at what do we need to do. So there's several reports, the Gardner report, McKinsey's put out a report looking at the future of work and specifically what HR organizations and benefit groups are doing to address total health, which encompasses not only the physical, but also mental health. And one very strong trend is that the benefits and looking at what the resources are not only providing for mental health of the employee, but also looking at what's being provided to family members. And this includes childcare. Are there innovative ways to help employees out with childcare? With elder care, for those that really are in that sandwich generation of not only supporting kids, but supporting parents and elder family members. Finding other ways to provide relief, different parent benefits that can really help employees feel like when they come to work, they feel that the organization cares about them and they are supported. What I find particularly interesting about this aspect of culture and feeling supported is a 2020 Gallup poll found that employees that felt engaged at work, and that engagement is driven by a couple of things. Is your organization a caring organization? And caring in a very genuine sense. So not kind of trying to say all the right things, but really walking the talk. And 2, are you engaged with your team and with your manager? I'll bring manager up later. I'm going to highlight that later because the role of manager is becoming more and more key. Always has been, but in terms of supporting behavioral health, it's reached really a new height in terms of the importance. So I'd like to kind of highlight what leaders can do as we go through these different aspects of why mental health needs to be addressed. So at this point, I would say that what's really important is look at what resources you're providing. Look at the utilization of those resources. Think outside the box. Look at what are best practices that are being developed, particularly if you're in a certain sector. What are trends around different ways, innovative ways of accessing mental health care, supports, and we'll definitely call out the EAP. EAPs can be an invaluable resource, although they are dramatically underutilized. And they have been, unfortunately, dramatically underutilized for 30 to 40 years. So it's also looking into how can we make this resource more visible to people? It's often about communication and educating around what are these resources. There are lots of myths around EAP, so it's important to be very clear with your workforce around what EAPs can do within a confidential workplace. So the second reason I believe that workplace mental health is going to continue to be addressed is the intersection of physical and mental well-being. So we know that when you look at chronic illnesses or significant illnesses like diabetes, cancer, cardiovascular health, just to list a few, that the intersection between depression and anxiety is significant. So whether it's that someone has recently been diagnosed with a chronic health issue or a significant health issue, and that is leading to a reaction that includes depression, anxiety, which is completely normative and understandable, or it is the flip, that depression, anxiety, reactions to trauma are resulting in lifestyle issues or difficulty managing, which again is understandable, which is impacting your health. And the comorbidity of that is significant in the outcome in terms of being able to work, being able to function, let alone work, being able to function in your life, be able to be there for your family. And what that means in terms of healthcare costs is truly staggering. So, you know, there's a way in which I hate to bring in costs and dollars to this, but it's real. There's a real reason to address mental health in the workplace. And so if we can think about how do you support and shore up your mental well-being and those of your employees, then that is going to have an impact on physical health. And there is a real positive win-win there when we're doing that. So, excuse me. So, all right. So there's mental health, behavioral health. We know that's impacting. We know that physical and mental health interacts with each other in a way that can really create some functional challenges for folks. So the way that really shows up, the third reason that we're going to continue talking about this is productivity. So absenteeism is something we're familiar with, people calling it sick. In some work sectors, people just not showing up for the work for days on end. The other piece that's being recognized more and more is this concept of presenteeism. And presenteeism is when folks are showing up at work and doing the work, but not engaged in the work, kind of what we used to say, phoning it in. And you can see that, especially if you see a change in how someone's functioning and engaging with the work. It's not getting the work done as creatively, as enthusiastically, not engaging team members to collaborate. It could be that the work is getting done at a slower pace. The quality of the work is not what you expect. Those are ways in which presenteeism shows up. It can certainly be related to anxiety, to depression. It could also be driven by other reasons, worries about family, pain. There are lots of reasons that presenteeism can happen. And what we know is that while absenteeism has been studied, and we can look at the cost, as you see here, to what absenteeism costs companies on an annual basis, it's harder to study presenteeism. There's a lot being done in the last couple of years to really dig into how can we really assess presenteeism. So one piece that we often talk about at MindWise when we work with organizations is as a manager, as a leader, as a team member, doesn't always fall upon leadership. As a team member, if you have a coworker that you notice something is a bit different, rather than getting into judging mode or kind of, you know, what's going on with them, which it's easy to do. We're all busy. We have a lot on our plate. It's important to think about, so what's going on? This person is, my gosh, I always counted on them to have amazing ideas and to just always just stellar work. And there's something that's shifted. So this would lead to why it's important to think about culture. Reason number 4, culture is something that leadership, that everyone in the organization has a hand in influencing. And more we're talking about the culture of work. This is an underpinning of everything we're going to talk about today, honestly. It supports behavioral health. It supports folks feeling that they are more motivated, that they want to engage in the work. And again, I think what's really key and what struck me again from what Vic said this morning is when you think about folks in crisis, it's not the person that's always in crisis, it's the system that's in crisis. So this is part of what we're talking about is take a look at your work culture. And you may actually have a great work culture, which is fantastic. Then think about how can you maintain that? How can you build upon that? How can you remain aware of challenges that will continue to surface as a result of what's happening in our world, in the country, so that you're not kind of sitting back and relying on, okay, we've got a good culture, we've got a good work environment, people are happy, we've always done things this way, it's worked. But to really keep a hand, really stay on top of the pulse of what's happening. So I'll touch upon 2 frameworks that we use a lot when we talk about how do you build a supportive work culture, a caring work culture. And, you know, particularly when we talk about this with senior leadership, The word caring culture or supporting culture can sometimes seem soft. This is by no means soft. This is about protecting people's resilience, helping people be their best self, thinking about it from a strength-based perspective. And when people are feeling supported, they are doing better work, not only in terms of quantity, but the quality of the work. So it is, I often say this, it is really raising the bar rather than lowering the bar, which is a concern sometimes folks feel when they hear about building a culture of care. So psychological safety, many of you have likely heard about. Amy Edmondson has been championing this for 20 years. It is based on the premise that you can be who you are at work, that you can voice your opinions, your concerns, your doubts freely among your team and at work. You can take thoughtful risks in your work and know that you're trusted to take those risks. I think two of the most important parts of psychological safety are being able to make mistakes and admit to those mistakes. Not having to hide if you forgot to do something, if you made a mistake on something, but being able to say, this happened, really sorry, not sure what to do about it, and that your team and your leadership will respond with, all right, here's what we're going to do, and move into problem solving and learning mode, learning from the situation, rather than reprimanding. The other big piece that I find helpful about psychological safety is that there's an ability to provide feedback, not only between the old-fashioned way of supervisor, boss to employee, but that employees are able to provide feedback to leadership, constructive feedback to each other, and that it will be heard. So it's not simply, yeah, I heard you, but it's really heard and in optimal situations acted upon. So there are lots of ways to operationalize psychological safety. We can't get into that today. Really important framework. The other that we talk about a lot through our work at Riverside and MindWise is a trauma-informed approach. And when we're thinking about schools and workplaces increasingly, how do we think about a trauma-informed system? And what does that really mean? So in brief, a trauma-informed approach is necessitated by the fact that pre-COVID, statistics show that 5 out of 10 women and 6 out of 10 men had experienced at least one trauma in their lives. This is pre-COVID, and we know that trauma is underreported. So those are probably very modest statistics. So knowing that, the idea of a trauma-informed approach is we need to create an environment, a system, again, to think about from Vic's perspective, we need to think about a system that supports everyone, because it is not our role in the workplace to ask people what's going on in terms of, have you experienced trauma? Are you depressed? If folks want to share that, that is great. And I think it's important to be able to feel that and be supportive, but it's not our role to dig. So the best thing we can do is to provide a supportive environment for everyone. And to think about this as an individual, we are all individuals that are struggling and trying to do the best we can. And very much, I think now become very popular, the notion of thinking about what's happened to you, what's going on with you, rather than what's wrong with you. Really putting experiences and behavior in context. The trauma approach, the trauma-informed approach and psychological safety also have a lot to do with how we think about resources and how we think about training overall. I'll take a pause here in case anything's come up. Nick, any thoughts, comments?
We got a couple good questions, actually. One was right at the beginning here of your conversation on psychological safety. And Christina has asked, what are creative ways to build upon keeping a finger on the pulse? And I'm going to give you the other question as well, and I'll let you sort of circle these in. The other question is, in a world of in-person and remote workers, what happens to an organization's culture? And I know we're probably going to swing back and hit that one a little more later, but.
Yes. Who asked the last question about remote culture? Do we have a name of that?
I'm not sure what it's a.
Okay, so we will get to that. It is in the top 10, so we will get to that. Please, though, if I don't cover what you're asking about, then please let me know. Happy to talk more about it. It's a fantastic question and such a relevant question. So I will just kind of put a pin in that. We'll get to that. In terms of psychological safety and how to keep a pulse on that, I think the first thing that comes to mind that many organizations do, many HR teams do, is send out very quick surveys, but not just a couple times a year, perhaps on a more regular basis. However, I think the other way to really do it in a more effective, integrated way is to encourage checking in around how are you all doing in meetings, in team meetings, in staff meetings, and most importantly for who's ever leading those meetings, leadership, managers, to explicitly call out, I want to hear all ideas. Let's just put it all out there. Let's brainstorm and really engage in the classic brainstorming of listening and not commenting in terms of shutting down, not categorizing, oh, this is a good idea, this is not a good idea, but really letting all the ideas free flow. And very much putting out there that, hey, I may be wrong in this and what I'm thinking about this. Do people have other thoughts? Invite different perspectives in the dialogue. And if someone comes to you and has a suggestion about what can be done better, what might be happening that actually there could be a problem in this, listen to that and think about how do you circle back to that individual regarding your thoughts about that. Have you shared it with another team member? Have you shared it with your leadership? Circle back, because that's when folks know they've been heard. Hope that helps. So number 5, the incoming workforce. I have to say this is one of my favorite topics of late because there is so much around generational differences, some which I think are based on stereotypes, which we hear about, but a lot of exciting stuff about what the young incoming workforce, whatever generation you want to call it, but the folks that are graduating high school soon, going to college, the folks graduating college, these are all part of our future workforce. And what are they looking for? So there's a lot of literature on this. I really liked the way it was framed in this 2016 Gallup poll. And again, let's remember this is way pre-pandemic. That and the way they encapsulate it is the young workforce is looking for the big 6. So purpose. So purpose has been talked about in the leadership world, in business for decades now. Purpose is not a fad for young professionals coming in. Purpose is part of life. It's part of the work. It's part of why you take a job or don't take a job. And once you're in that job, what's the potential for development? How can you grow in your profession as an individual with your team? How can you grow your skills? How are you learning from your boss? Who more and more, there's a hope that the boss isn't simply someone you report to or get kind of instruction or projects from, but that you really get mentorship from, you get coaching from. And this comes from ongoing conversations, not, sure, still a need for annual evaluations or maybe, twice a year evaluations, but how can there be ongoing conversations? Because strength development is a huge goal. So not simply problem solving, putting a Band-Aid, getting through something, but developing strengths and new skills, perhaps. And what I really love about all of this is there's a way in which it puts L&D, learning and development, in a very different place in the work. It's not kind of over in the side as this is L&D stuff, do your, kind of extra learning over here. It's how do you integrate professional growth and learning on a regular basis into your workforce? Because as the young professionals would say, life is bigger than a job. Work is bigger than a job. So again, a whole different conversation, but for HR folks that are here with us today, direct, as you already know, direct impact on retention of your valued employees, but also recruiting. And we know, again, that recruiting can be a challenge these days. So really important to keep in mind what younger generation is looking for. So related to that, I'll share a really interesting project we did with a national trade organization here in the US. And they specifically wanted to look at the experience of their young professionals and how they could strengthen that group. It's a relatively smaller group within the trade organization, and they recognize that, boy, they've got leadership that's on the way out. They need to create new leaders. So we did a series of focus groups, which were phenomenal. One of my favorite things to do. And you could see here some of the comments. These are comments verbatim that we heard from folks, all different positions, administrators, managers, new members to the organization, some that were entrepreneurs in the organization and the trade association. So you can see that this mirrors what we just looked at in terms of what is a trend, a growing trend, a long-term trend now when we're looking at intergenerational differences. So again, the culture of the company matters. Want to make change, want to have real change. And mental health is not something to be stigmatized. In fact, an interesting comment that came up in this conversation, first time I heard this phrase, is that the younger generation is more comfortable talking about therapy. They're more comfortable talking about benefiting from therapy, looking for a therapist. They're more comfortable talking about, I'm on medication. And one of them made the comment that they were tired of, quote, pill shaming by what I would call senior, because I'm part of that group, senior leadership or senior workforce. So really important to think about, we need to question, how are we thinking about mental health at work? What are we saying? What are our attitudes that might be putting off those that really have a certain comfort level that's healthy? Other thoughts or questions that come up? If not, then I will move on. So, so the sixth reason, which really every one of these reasons could be a big conversation, is an increasingly diverse workforce. Very, very fortunately, in the last couple of years particularly, there has been such a recognition that we need to address diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging at work actively. And hopefully when organizations are doing this, it is not seen as a short-term initiative, but a recognition that it is the launch of a systemic aspect to work that is there to stay. Two really important things to think about in terms of a diverse workforce and how that intersects with mental health. One is we need to recognize that certain groups are disproportionately affected or at risk for mental health issues due to isms, whether it's racism, other kinds of isms, bias, stereotypes. And because of those stressors that affect certain groups, there is, again, a greater risk for mental health challenges. Again, this echoes, very plainly, not the sophisticated way that Vic talked about this morning, that there's certain groups that really have challenges that need to be met. And we need to think about how are we supporting that in the workplace? How am I being supported in the workplace based on my ethnicity, based on my gender, based on other ways that I may identify? So that's one. The second is more and more employees that are very comfortable talking about their mental health challenges, that are comfortable talking about if they have diagnosis, if they have anxiety, depression, that they want to be able to talk about this at work as a diversity issue, if you will. And in addition to the aspect or the recognition that neurodiversity is present and more talked about in the workplace is huge. Neurodiversity, for many of you, I am sure know about it. Neurodiversity is a term that can include those that have atypical learning styles, that can include folks that might be considered on the spectrum. It can include dyslexia, it can include ADHD in some situations. Some definitions also include anxiety and depression in neurodiverse populations. So, and those groups are becoming more and more powerful, really, in certain organizations. So how do we support? What's the action item here? By leadership, this is where I'm going to draw Nick into the conversation. The reason I say that is because we're going to talk about the role of ERGs, employee resource groups, also called affinity groups, Different organizations have different creative names for them. The main common characteristic of these groups is they're employees that come together because they have shared experiences. They identify as part of a group, whether it's through their experiences, identity, their concerns, or their causes. And they want to come together to have a voice, to have a safe place that they can speak to one another, to think about how can they be more visible? How can they get support from their community? And the one thing I'll emphasize is ERGs are not just great for the folks that are in that particular EAG. They are beneficial to the entire organization because they're adding tremendous diversity to the organization. Nick, I'm going to pull you in because in addition to Nick's range of work that he does at MindWise, he is a leader in the Riverside ERG and I believe instrumental in kind of really bringing that together. So we'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. It has been a really interesting and eye-opening experience being part of the ERGs at Riverside. It takes, I feel like it ties actually into so many of the other of your top 10 reasons here. It really, being in the ERG creates an opportunity to feel a little more seen in a lot of ways, as sort of taking something, an aspect of that, a way that I identify with the group that normally I would have either considered to be a liability or something that's at the very best was just not helpful at work, and actually bring it to be, okay, this aspect of myself or of this way I identify is actually not only benefits my work, but it can benefit the whole organization. So it's been pretty amazing to use that to serve the sort of larger goal of making the organization, making the workplace, both for myself and for my coworkers, to be more comfortable, more safe, more productive.
Yeah. And every time I hear about the work that you're doing, I am struck by the various people that are doing this work, for one thing, but also you've talked about what's been really fulfilling about it and what's been the progress you've made, but I also wonder about what the challenges have been and what other folks may experience as they're either starting ERGs or wanting to grow their ERGs.
Absolutely. It's both a good and a bad thing. I think of the whole process is that it's coming from us, the employees. So it's very, what we have to say and what we're trying to do and what we're trying to change is very authentic. It's the real concerns of the community in this workplace. But because of that, it means the work has to come from us on top of our day jobs. So it's a matter of carving out the time to put in this work, in the ERG, to dig into what it means to be, a diverse workforce, and to have these differences and what that means and how we can help each other, which could honestly be my full-time job, but it's what I'm doing and added to it. Right. And I'm happy to be able to, but it's a new challenge to have to balance those two things.
And that I've heard you made the point, and I think it is such an important point, because what you're saying is this is part of the work. What I'm doing is valuable to my job, to the organization. This is part of the work. And so it shouldn't be off to the side. So again, I feel like it is related to not being siloed. How do you integrate this? How do you give that feedback to leadership? Because I can imagine ideally what you want from ERGs is it's driving conversation, it's driving ideas that could benefit the organization as a whole. So it's got to make its way up to
Absolutely.
the decision makers.
One of our first big goals is to say, we're here, we're helping, like we're part of the organization's overall effort to be a better workforce, a better workplace, to sort of to form all this into about, we're trying to help attract the younger workforce to make this be a workplace that people want to be at. And we're saying, okay, so first off, you have to recognize that this work that we're doing is important. So,
that's right.
Help us do it.
So I have one more question, or would love to get your thoughts on this. And then there may be questions coming in specifically for you about ERGs. Oh, let's take this one. How many employees does Riverside have? How is the ERG guided so it is productive and not a complaint session? Wow, that's a great one.
A bunch of ERG questions. Okay, so Riverside has about 1,700 total full-time and part-time employees. And we're a pretty interesting organization in that we're spread out through a whole range of different sites and programs. So it really, I think it's extra important that we have this ERG, because each little workforce, or each little team can be very different, can have a very different experience. So making sure that like where I am, so okay, in a little more personal detail, the ERG that I am the chair of is the LGBTQ+ employee resource group. And so I happen in my team and at MindWise at Riverside, I've never had an issue being open about who I was and, you know, my life. And, you know, especially during the pandemic where we've all lived our lives together in front of each other else on camera, you know, it's hard not to be yourself all the time. And I've never had that problem, but there could easily be other little pockets of the organization where that's not the case. So being able to sort of loop all those in together. How are we guided so that we're productive? That is a great question, because that is something that we kind of have to do ourselves. We have guidance from our Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion. We have a set of bylaws that we put together as an organization or as a group on our own, with some guidance from leadership. But we really, it's being shaped by us. It's being driven by us. It's what we as the employees want, what we want to focus on, and what we want to try to make a difference, or how we want to try to make a difference, what areas we want to focus on. And that's one of the big things we're doing is there's dozens of issues we could pick up, but we're trying to say, well, what are the top 2 or 3 that we can work on right now? And we'll focus on those, we'll make some progress. And then in a year, we'll reevaluate, we'll come out, we'll see if those are still our top choices, and we'll keep pushing through. I see there's another question that came in on the chat, which I'm going to jump in on, about who starts and organizes the ERG. I think, and Lisa, you know more about the specifics of it, but I can tell you about how this actual one happened.
Absolutely.
It's driven by the organization's desire to, or as part of the diversity, inclusion, and equity effort, to hear from these different groups of employees. And it literally sort of went out from the VP of diversity and inclusion to say who wants to try to do this. So we literally came in as volunteers, working with the D&I committee to say, we'll do this. Now, what do we do? And we got like the template bylaws, we edited them, we figured them out, and then we made a big effort to push out to all of our colleagues and coworkers across the organization who wants to be part of this organization with us, this group. And then it's very grassroots, it's very ground up. We're building it ourselves to make sure that our voices are authentic. It wouldn't be helpful to the organization if we were not bringing something that they already heard. These are the voices that they need to hear that they haven't necessarily been hearing, you know, before now.
Nick, thank you for that. And one piece I want to highlight is that, so one way that I heard that it's not, as one person asked, a complaint session, is that you have a direct link to someone in leadership, the VP of D&I, so that your voice is being represented in the leadership realm. So it feels like that's really particularly important. Thank you for that. The silo piece is really interesting to me when we think about leadership action and it not being siloed, because this may not be the best comparison, but for many years I worked in college counseling, and it is a time developmentally where students are forming their own groups, whether it's based on ethnicity, race, interest, and sometimes those groups don't communicate with one another. So I wonder, in ERGs, do you find that there's good communication between ERG groups?
It's key. I mean, we're like, I feel bad to keep falling back on this, but we're sort of figuring it out as we go. But Riverside right now, it's 3 ERGs, and we have found that it is key that we, the 3 chairs, meet on a regular basis. So we meet as part of the organization's diversity and inclusion committee. So that's happening at least once a month. But then just the 3 of us, the chairs, will meet generally once a month, sometimes more frequently, just to stay in on what we're working on, what ideas we're having, what issues might be coming up, and to make sure we're in sync. A lot of it, we found at one point that we were simply scheduling on top of each other, and there is enough of an overlap of folks who would like to be part of the different groups that we want to make sure that everyone can participate in each of them. Part of communication, I want to jump in another one of these questions I'm seeing come in on the chat, is which is specifically, what if an older generation of gay men are traumatized by the Q word, but now in the workplace it has become an acceptable term, while for others it brings up a lot of trauma. I don't want to go too into the whole LGBTQ+ world, but I think this does speak to an important thing that's coming up in the ERGs is about the different different demographics in the group. So we have some folks who are already in this new workforce, fresh out of college, ready to talk about mental health and therapy and their, you know, potential diagnoses and who knows what else, and also embracing things like taking the Q word from being a pejorative to a term of empowerment. I personally also am in the same boat. I have plenty of awful memories of that word that I don't like to revisit, but it's in the ERG, our job is to create an environment, a place that's comfortable for those younger folks coming in, but also for everyone who's already here in the workforce from, you know, age, you know, 0 up. So we're trying to balance that, to balance the needs of everyone there and not just focusing on this one group, and how do we make it a comfortable, safe space for everybody?
Thank you, Nick. And those were fantastic questions, really great questions. Thank you for sharing that, Nick. And at any point, if you have additional questions, please put them in the chat. So we did spend a bit of time on ERGs. We find that it's incredibly helpful because it does address supporting mental health and, again, how that intersects with supporting diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging in an organization. And that is tied to the culture, and that is tied to whether employees want to stay at your job, at your workplace, and if they want to join your company or your school or wherever it is that you're working. So the next reason that I think is becoming incredibly important as to why this trend of supporting behavioral health at work is going to continue is that managers are being affected. Managers have always played a key role in organizations and leading teams, in being leaders. And what we're finding in the pandemic is that the stress that has been placed on managers and their self-reporting of mental health issues has really skyrocketed. So if you see this, this study from, it's a Verizon workplace study that was done very recently, June 2021, 87% of global managers reported that they were experiencing, or team members were experiencing a mental health issue. So I highlight this because too often when we talk about supporting workplace mental health, we don't think about leadership. We don't think about managers. We think about what can we do to our team? What can we do for our team to support them? And so it's incredibly important as an organization to support your leaders, to support your managers, whether that is providing training, whether that's recognizing that they are under a lot of strain and checking in with them, and training that would be helpful to them. Survey, check in, ask them what kind of training, what kind of supports, what kind of learning would be helpful to them. There was a question in the chat that I saw earlier, which I feel is perhaps tangentially related, which was about clinicians. As clinicians, we're doing work to support the people we serve, our clients. How do we take care of ourselves? So more and more, we are talking about self-care when we talk with organizations. And we're not talking about self-care simply from the perspective of do some deep breathing and take walks and take days off. All of that is incredibly important. It is incredibly important. But we also have to think about care differently. We have to think about how are we leading in an empathic way? How are we being empathic with ourselves? How are we giving permission to ourselves and to others to say, no, my plate is full right now. I can't take that on. Can you check in a week? Can you check in X amount of time to see if I could take this on? To create boundaries between work and home, to really think about what does that care look like? And how can we take care of ourselves? How can we show compassion to ourselves? So really appreciate that question that someone put in the chat about the real struggles for clinicians that are doing the work. And, you know, I think part of that question was one can have trainings that are designed, how is you as a clinician can better support, how can you better support the clients you serve? But what about training in terms of how we can take care of ourselves? How can we provide peer support perhaps for ourselves? So really, really important question, again, highlights that that's a workforce issue. It's an issue for clinicians. It's a challenge for clinicians, but it is something the organization that is employing the clinicians also needs to be committed to. We think about this very actively and have been talking about it very actively at Riverside right now, because we are largely an organization that is comprised of caregivers and clinicians. So this gets to the remote work. The reason that we will need to continue supporting mental health in the workplace is that this trend of remote and hybrid work is here to stay. We know that the realities of whether it's health issues, whether it's honestly productivity, a lot of people are finding that they're more productive or as productive at home. So why deal with the commute? Why put yourself at risk with health issues? So as we work remotely, what are the challenges? This has been going on since the pandemic. It can still continue. We also know that it's not just the pandemic we've been dealing with in the last 2 years. There's much more that's been going on in this country, in the world. And this uncertainty and the stress is going to continue in other ways. So how can we best prepare for it? And for folks that are doing remote work, how can we recognize what the challenge is and then how leadership and an organization can support them? So one, a lot of materials, lots of Zoom calls. It's cognitive overload, seeing a bunch of talking heads, not having that in-person communication, and a lot coming at you, whether it's emails, whether it's Teams messages, Google Hangout, lots of information, text messages. So how do you manage that? How do you manage that cognitive load? Not having those, depriving of the senses, not being in a different environment, not even having that commute to work where on one hand, it's nice not to have it. On the other hand, you miss the podcast or the music or what have you. And then the inner critic that comes up. Whether it's we're on Zoom calls, we don't like how our voice sounds, we don't like how we look. We feel like there's lots to criticize if we get in that space. And that can really be a challenge when we're working remotely. We don't have the distraction of other people to take us away from that. And then the cognitive dissonance of, I've made the choice to work remotely, so I have to like this choice, but it's a little confusing because I missed some of the other pieces. So certainly remote work can be challenging. So what can we do? What are these are really basic kinds of brass tacks kinds of things that folks can do. Schedule breaks, give permission if you're a manager to schedule breaks. If you're a team member, give your colleague, say, if you have lunch, go have lunch. We'll meet later. We can meet 15 minutes later. Schedule your meetings to be 45 minutes rather than an hour. Or 50 minutes rather than an hour. Really think about, it's great to chit chat in meetings. I would say our MindWise crew, we are champion chit chatters. But really important to think about, are you giving transition time for folks between meetings? Reproduce the office, whether it's respectful but funny memes, jokes that you could share, small talk, scheduling coffee chats, have a cup of coffee while you're having your coffee chat. Try to reproduce the office as much as possible. Phone calls. I remember just a quick anecdote, our executive director, I remember the beginning of the pandemic would have meetings with one of our team members and they would both walk and they would talk on the phone. And I think they came to that because they both realized they were just kind of missing. They were missing that physical activity, tired of sitting at the computer. So think about, could this be a phone call? A phone call can be just as beneficial at times. Again, we all know, take breaks, move around whenever possible. And then, use technology. Nick is the genius around technology and how we can use this. Use technology in creative ways to bring people together. So just some ideas. And, from a leadership perspective, trust and flexibility and boundaries are key. Trust that your teams are working, they're doing their work. They're going to get their work done. You don't need to micromanage. Flexibility for their time. Things have to shift. Something comes up, someone's got to be carpooled. The work is still getting done and probably will get done even better. Have that flexibility and respect for boundaries. Because they're at home, because we've got our computers, doesn't mean we should be expected to answer all the time. I think all of us get our work done well. It's okay to say, I'm going to turn off my computer for the evening.
Lisa, I
So
want to jump in
go. Yes,
really quick,
please.
just to refer back to the question that we had at the beginning about how to handle culture in the world of in-person and remote workers. I think you sort of covered it, but I wanted to make sure. And I also wanted to highlight another comment that just came through in the chat that I would love to hear your thoughts on. Katie says, one struggle with small talk remotely is that the most accessible mode is monitored. And that just really made me think about what you just said about the importance of leadership with the trust, the flexibility and respect that obviously if we're small talking over Zoom, over Teams, over Google Chat, over wherever it is, it's being recorded, it's being checked, which creates this extra concern. So I think that just highlights the importance of the trust factor, right?
Absolutely. Very well said, Nick. Absolutely. It's a trust factor. It also harkens back to the culture. Is this a culture where one feels monitored? You know, I remember a year ago, kind of in the middle of the pandemic, there was a program about all the different ways that employees can, you know, through keystrokes and all this stuff, know when employees are working because they're expected to work a certain number of hours. So that's a very different type of culture than what we're talking about. We're talking about a culture where if it is recorded, your boss is going to appreciate and like the fact that you're making small talk and laughing for 5 or 10 minutes before you get to the work, because in that 30-minute meeting, it could be that 20 minutes, you're getting as much done in 30 minutes, but you've had some human connection in those 10 minutes. So absolutely, Nick, it's about trust. It's also about knowing the culture that you're operating in. And if you have concerns that that culture isn't there, who could you turn to? Who are like-minded folks? Is there an internal champion at your organization that you could begin this conversation with? This is a question we get asked a lot when we talk about cultural transformation, is how do you start the process? And it's looking for that internal champion or champions. I hope that answered the question. So we are almost at 10. So 9 would be the recognition that certain sectors are at greater risk for suicide, substance misuse, and mental health struggles. So this conference, the overarching theme is suicide prevention. I mean, we very much in our work at MindWise, and I very much believe that when we're talking about supporting behavioral health, it is a very much upstream approach at preventing suicide at the end of the day. We want to catch problems early, catch struggles early, and support folks. We do know that there are sectors where the risk is much higher and the incidence of death by suicide is higher. So for instance, the CDC for numerous years has identified in, sectors or industries like construction, manufacturing, agriculture, first responders as being at risk for suicide. And in the pandemic, we know that healthcare workers, due to burnout, compassion fatigue, post-traumatic stress, vicarious trauma, have been at increased risk for depression and death by suicide. So the reason for this could be the nature of the work. It could be that the financially it's not as stable. There's lots of shifting around, location of the work. So there's that instability. It can also be that the physical nature of the work can create injury and pain, which can lead to substance misuse. So calling out that this is a reason we will absolutely continue to focus on mental health in the workplace because some sectors are at risk and we're recognizing that more. I'll give a quick example of kind of a case study of sorts of the work we do, for instance, in the construction industry. And the construction industry has recognized that mental health is a safety issue. So when a person comes to work feeling depressed and they don't really care how they're doing, or they don't really care about their work, or they're feeling anxious and they can't focus, or they're under the influence, that is a safety hazard. And so we need to think about mental health and supporting behavioral health in the workplace from that perspective. So if you're a leader in a sector that is high risk, I would say absolutely engage folks that have expertise in that realm. Think about what trainings and resources you could provide that will be proactive in nature. So how can you educate your workforce around what mental health looks like, how it shows up at work, what the impact is? How can you be prepared for mental health crisis situations at work proactively? And then if there is an unfortunate situation, a loss, death by suicide, accident, even violent situation, how can you have a post-vention response that will help healing, promote healing and moving on? So I want to leave a few minutes for questions. So I am going to move on to the 10th, which I think hopefully is one of the most important reasons, which is that this is the right thing to do. That when we talk about supporting mental health, it needs to come from an authentic place because as people and as employees, we can tell if there's an inauthentic voice in this. If an organization's talking about it because it's the thing to say these days, it's a tagline, that's not really going to fly. It's not really going to create the culture you want. So we can talk about the bottom line, we can talk about productivity, retention, we can talk about recruiting. At the end of the day, if we're going to support one another through these difficult times, we really need to continue focusing on mental health because it's the right thing to do. So with that, I will open up to any questions or chat. Nick.
Nothing has come through just the moment, though someone, Deb just points out to what you were just speaking about the industries that are sort of more at risk for suicide and other issues. Deb's comment, this feels similar to our commercial fishing industry workers, which I think is exactly the same kind of idea, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's very at risk. It is demanding work. It can be dangerous work. The financial security can be up and down. We actually have a team member, Jim McCulley, who has expertise in working with the fishing industry, does a lot of work, and really talks about how people don't understand, the ups and downs involved and the risk, and how depression and suicide risk can be so prominent. So if that's something you'd like to have a conversation about, please feel free to email me and happy to continue that. Everyone will get a copy of the deck, so you'll get a copy of these takeaways. So just kind of want to assure you with that. And somebody put in the chat, I saw a question about resources, some references, I think. Nick, did you see that one?
There was a question about resources to sort of make the case for ERGs, I believe, unless there was another. We also just got one about, can you offer any ideas about other ways to make EAPs more visible?
Oh, great question. Absolutely. Talk about it, send out information about it on a regular basis. So most folks, when we've done surveys around this and focus groups, folks that are in top leadership positions throughout the organization have no idea what an EAP is, because we hear about it when we're onboarding and then don't hear about it again. So make it visible. A few times a year, send out a reminder, hey, don't forget about your EAP. It's most EAPs are at no cost to you. Remind them how many sessions they get. Remind them, this is very key, that it is 100% confidential. The employer, your company, does not hear about your experience at the EAP. If I go to an EAP, it is protected health information. It cannot circle back to the employer. Often EAPs can also support and see immediate family members. That's important to know. So the first step is for you to be, whatever your role is, and if it's in HR or a related area, be very familiar with what your EAP offers, how to access them, what the areas of specialty are. Some will offer financial advice, for instance, or financial training, as well as support for loss. So make it visible, educate around it.
I'll just add, throwing my marketing hat on for a second, don't just send a bunch of emails. The many ways you can tell your employees about it. Send them the emails, yes, but then provide some sort of flyers, or if there's a bulletin board, if there's a general announcements thing where you're talking to everyone with your, like, just say it in different ways, because eventually people just sort of, if it's all an email, will just really make any connection. And
point.
Lisa, Christina has reminded me that there was a question about references. She was asking if we could get the references to the polls and studies we referred to throughout your presentation, which I believe we can make sure we get those.
Yes, I will do that. I'll add that to this before it's sent out so that everyone has that. And I want to make sure we stay on time because we have an amazing afternoon program. So thank you, everyone. If there's a question that we didn't get to, feel free to email me. There's my email, and happy to continue the conversation. So thanks so much for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of the conference.